Hi, this is Blaine Cluton for Cluton Law. The question today is what determines spousal support in a divorce? And I've answered this question for Oregon, where I went through the different types of spousal support and what will impact those different areas of support. But this is more broadly, and an important thing to note on the top of this video is that I have to give a disclaimer that the rules vary so much from state to state in what actually determines spousal support that if you still have questions, which you should, I would recommend that you talk to an attorney that's competent in your state to explain the rules more fully. But let's talk broadly. So there is the Uniform Marriage and Divorce Act, which does provide some guidelines for spousal support. Only a handful of states have actually adopted this act, but many states have adopted parts or portions of the act, if not the full act. So let's look at some of the things that are going to actually impact spousal support. So whether or not one of the parties was working during the marriage, whether one of the parties stayed home to support the children, whether one of the parties received extra training while the other spouse stayed home, whether one of the spouses has foregone training or worked a lower end job to allow the other spouse to continue working. And another important consideration is the property at issue in the divorce. So it's certainly possible that one party in the divorce, if one of the parties has worked more or has more of these factors in their favor, could be awarded more of the property in lieu or instead of getting spousal support. In Oregon, we call this the getting the long half, but more reasonably, you could think about this in any sort of situation. One party could be awarded the house with all the equity instead of getting spousal support, and this would be the way to compensate them for not getting the spousal support. A way that this further breaks down is whether or not, for instance, a working wife is entitled to spousal support. And the question here is still going to be circling back to the top half where we're asking about has the working wife worked a lower end job, worked less hours, spent a significant amount of time at home with the children instead of being in the workforce? Does the working wife in this scenario need to be retrained to get a higher paying job to enter the workforce again after marriage? So in Oregon, what we talk about is whether it's just and equitable, just and proper. So the question is not equalizing incomes between the two spouses, but is it important to make sure that working spouse, the working wife in this hypothetical, has risen to the appropriate level and gotten the appropriate education so that it looks fair, more or less. Another way that this comes in is the length of the marriage, and does length of the marriage impact spousal support or alimony? It does, and most frequently what it's associated with is the amount of time or duration that spousal support is going to be paid after the divorce. So the longer the marriage, the longer period that alimony is going to be paid after the divorce is final. And it's also going to impact the amount of support. So the actual amount is going to increase generally the longer the marriage is. So if you have a very short-term marriage and everything else is roughly equal, it's going to be much less than a longer term marriage under the same circumstances. So if one of the parties is now saying to you that we're going to pay you spousal support, but you disagree with the amount, so you're at that point in the divorce, how do you fight it? Well, one thing you can do is obviously get an attorney so you really understand all the factors and all the determinations that are going to go into the court's decision. But the other thing is to bring the battle in front of the judge and let the judge decide. So that's typically how it's done if you want to fight it. And you're going to need the facts on your side depending on what the court looks at in your jurisdiction for the important considerations. So how does the judge actually determine what the spousal support award is going to be? They're going to look at all these things that we talked about, and they're going to weigh them generally. And this is where I said at the beginning, the laws vary from state to state. So this is when it's important to talk to an attorney in your area to really understand what your particular judge is going to look at and weigh more heavily than anything else, or what they're going to consider at all. Because in many jurisdictions like Oregon, there are no clear guidelines for what the judge will order or award. There's no formula, there's no ratio or anything like that that the court's going to look at as far as saying, this is the duration of the marriage, this is the income, and we're going to equalize this out. It doesn't work like that in Oregon, and in many jurisdictions there's no clear guidelines. So this is why it's so important to talk to an attorney. The last thing is grounds. People usually ask about grounds for whether or not the party is entitled to alimony or support. And this is going to vary slightly from state to state, but generally what we're looking at is those factors again, and whether one party is significantly disadvantaged by not receiving spousal support. So let's give another example here. If one of the parties is now injured or physically unable to work, or for some reason has some mental incapability, at that point, when the court is looking at it, they're going to say, this person is just not able to work. And that would certainly be a reason that you could raise as grounds. If one spouse is working and one is not because they're physically unable or mentally unable, then that's the type of things that the court is going to look at when considering whether or not to award spousal support or alimony. If you have further questions about your particular situation and your particular fact pattern, I'd encourage you to talk to an attorney. This has just been some general guidelines to help get you pointed in the right direction. This is Blaine Cluten for Cluten Law. Thank you.